At the anniversary party, he planned to impress the family. My father-in-law handed me divorce papers with a smug smile, convinced I'd crumble. What he didn't know? The mansion he built his legacy on was already mine. Stick around for this story of betrayal, strategy, and a twist that left the entire family stunned. Subscribe if you love watching the underestimated rise stronger. At the garden party held in our honor, my father-in-law raised a champagne flute and toasted my downfall. He didn't use those exact words, of course. To everyone else under the white canopies strung with fairy lights, it sounded like praise. He called me resilient, supportive, exactly what this family needed after the loss of Clarissa, my husband's late mother, his only real connection to warmth. But I knew better. I caught the glint in his eyes, the careful way he placed a manila envelope in my lap when no one was watching, the faint smirk as I stared down at it, heart turning to ice even as my smile remained fixed, flawless. I'd been trained for this, to stay poised under pressure, to preserve the illusion. I slipped the envelope into my purse without a word. My fingers didn't tremble. They hadn't in years. "To Zoe," Charles Holloway announced, his voice booming over the crowd. "The woman who brought light back into this house. A toast to a true partner." Everyone clapped. Even my husband, Ethan, who barely glanced at me. He was busy watching a blonde assistant from his architectural firm flirt with the sommelier. She touched his sleeve with that exaggerated intimacy only women secure in their position dare to use. But she wasn't my concern anymore. The envelope was. Inside it, as I already suspected, were divorce papers, not filed by Ethan, but by his father. A strategic maneuver, a preemptive strike, a declaration of war masked as legal efficiency. The Holloways didn't believe in mess. They believed in control. And I'd been a liability from the start. I sat through the rest of the party like a statue carved in marble, posed, perfect, numb. Only when the last guest had filtered out through the wrought iron gates of the Holloway estate did Charles finally speak plainly. "You've had a good run," he said, refilling his scotch without offering me any. "But this arrangement has run its course." I turned to him slowly. The summer air was thick with magnolia and condescension. "Arrangement?" I asked, my voice smooth as silk. He gave a short laugh, the kind reserved for boardroom conquests. "Marriage is a transaction, Zoe. I thought you understood that. You came with nothing. You leave with dignity if you sign quietly." The mansion loomed behind him. 3 stories of curated legacy and generational wealth. I'd spent 7 years making it feel like home, planting gardens, restoring antique moldings, hosting charity dinners that improved the Holloway name in social columns across 3 counties. "I built a life here," I said, not quite a protest, just a statement of fact. "No, my dear," he corrected. "You were placed here, by my son, like furniture, comfortable for a time, but eventually outdated." My heart didn't break. It calcified. I'd suspected this was coming. Ethan had been pulling away for months. Cold silences, mysterious weekend trips, cryptic emails left open just long enough for me to read. But I hadn't expected Charles to strike first. I also hadn't expected to feel so ready. "Ethan knows about this?" I asked. Charles raised a brow, as if I'd asked whether water was wet. "He doesn't need to. You'll be gone before it matters. He's already moved on emotionally. We're just cleaning up the paperwork. And the mansion? Will remain in the Holloway name, of course. You were never on the deed." Of course I wasn't. He handed me a sleek pen with the family crest embossed on the barrel. "Just sign. We'll give you a generous settlement, enough to start over." I stared at the pen for a long time, then smiled and said, "You know, Charles, I've always admired this garden." He blinked, confused. "I spent months redesigning it after Clarissa passed. Remember how overgrown it was? How lifeless?" He said nothing. I brought it back, layered the soil, replanted the beds, installed the irrigation, chose every color palette for every bloom. A pause. "I know," I said softly, "because this is what I do, Charles. I restore things." And then I handed him back the pen and stood. I didn't sign. Not then. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that tucked away in a locked drawer of my studio was a notarized agreement Clarissa had signed before her death, a trust modification, one that changed the estate's inheritance structure, one that gave me rights to the mansion under very specific conditions, one of which Charles had just triggered by attempting to forcibly remove me without cause. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to scream or cry or beg. I just needed to wait. Wait and prepare. Because if they wanted war, they'd have it. And when I was done, The same people who clapped at that garden party would be reading about my victory in the Wall Street Journal. But for now, I returned to the main house and poured myself a glass of champagne left over from the party. I raised it toward the ornate chandelier, my reflection fractured in 1,000 prisms. To restoration, I whispered, and reclamation. By the next morning, the entire house had shifted. Not physically. Its marble floors still gleamed beneath the chandeliers. The imported wallpaper remained pressed and perfect, but something deeper had altered. Like the foundation had sighed, aware a storm was approaching. Maybe it was me. Maybe I had finally stopped being a fixture and started becoming a force. Ethan hadn't come home the night before. Typical. The man was allergic to discomfort, and his father had all but guaranteed him a clean exit. No confrontation, no conversation, just a quietly erased marriage and a newly redesigned life, probably already curated by Marina, his firm's junior partner with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a mind as shallow as his ambition. But Charles hadn't calculated correctly, and Clarissa, God bless her, had been smarter than all of them combined. I waited until noon, when the house staff rotated shifts. No one questioned me walking down the east wing toward the family archive. It was technically my responsibility, curating the Holloway legacy, organizing documents for preservation, maintaining the estate's vast paper trail of ownership, philanthropy, and social relevance. They called it a wife's duty, though I had more degrees than Ethan and spoke fluent French, while he still struggled with basic tax documents. The archive was behind a locked oak door, tucked beside the conservatory. Only 2 people had the key, Charles and me. I entered quietly, locking the door behind me. Dust danced in golden sunbeams slicing through the blinds. Dozens of fireproof filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with care. My work. My hands had touched every one of these documents over the years, cataloging tax filings, title deeds, insurance policies, philanthropic trusts, real estate investments. The Holloways had built their wealth on precision, which made their arrogance all the more useful to me. They never suspected I was watching. I crossed to the back wall and opened a cabinet marked Clarissa Holloway, 1990-2018. Inside, carefully preserved, was a slim leather-bound folder I'd tucked away 3 years earlier. Not hidden, just ignored. Charles hadn't touched it since Clarissa's death. The folder was labeled, Personal Property Reallocation, Addendum to Holloway Trust. Inside, 3 notarized pages signed in Clarissa's meticulous cursive, dated 6 months before her final hospitalization. Witnessed, certified, buried under an avalanche of more important documents by her husband, who never considered that his grief might make him overlook something legally binding. She had written, "In the event that Charles or Ethan seek to dissolve Zoe's marriage without cause or evidence of breach, all Holloway estate holdings currently under my name shall transfer to Zoe Holloway within 30 business days of notice, including but not limited to the primary residence at 68 Sylvan Hill Road, the adjoining guest house, and all inherited furnishings, as a measure of protection and moral alignment." She had known. She had seen them for who they were. A shudder passed through me, not fear, but something close to awe. Clarissa had always been quiet, even elegant in her restraint, but she hadn't been weak. She'd survived 31 years of marriage to a man who thought compassion was a liability, and in the end, she'd left me something stronger than love, leverage. I scanned the document, then carefully placed it in a fireproof folio. From the drawer beneath, I pulled the living trust summary and cross-referenced the names. The mansion title had indeed passed briefly through Clarissa's name before being folded into the Holloway Real Estate Holdings LLC, after the date of the amendment. Legally, it was still vulnerable to her final wishes. If I filed the clause with a court-appointed trust executor, the title transfer could be triggered automatically, especially now that Charles had provided a written attempt at eviction under the guise of a third-party initiated divorce. I didn't need to fight for the house. I just needed to prove the conditions had been met, but I also knew Charles would fight back. So I photographed everything. Every page, every signature, every seal. Uploaded copies to 3 encrypted cloud drives and a flash drive. I slid into a hidden pocket of my leather planner. The originals went back into their folder, hidden inside an envelope labeled Event Menus 2016 and filed under Miss Kieran Receptions. Even if Charles came looking, he'd never find them. And if he did, he'd never guess they were already out of his reach. Back upstairs, the mansion buzzed with afternoon inertia. The chef prepped for dinner. The cleaning staff fluffed pillows no one sat on. I moved through the rooms like I had for years. An apparition in heels. Elegant. Forgettable. But everything I touched now felt different. I owned this moment. The truth hummed like electricity beneath my skin. When Ethan finally walked in at 5:47 p.m., he didn't greet me. He never did anymore. Just dropped his keys into the antique bowl in the foyer and loosened his tie like a weary soldier returning from a hard-fought war. He looked tired, but not in the way men look after working hard. He looked bored, entitled, restless. His eyes flicked toward me briefly. "My father spoke with you?" "Mm-hmm," I said, stirring tea at the kitchen island. "Lovely chat." He rolled his eyes and walked to the bar cart, pouring himself a bourbon he didn't earn. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said. I smiled over my cup. "Then don't make it." He paused, finally catching a note of something new in my voice. Suspicion. Or maybe fear. "Zoe," he said slowly, "what are you planning?" I turned to him, leaning against the marble counter. "Just restoration," I said softly. "Nothing you'd understand." He narrowed his eyes. "I don't want to fight." "You won't get one." That was the truth. I wouldn't fight. I'd win. He left the room like a man who'd just realized his dog had learned how to pick the lock on the gate. That night, I wrote Elena's number on a small note card and slid it into the inside pocket of my handbag. Elena Roberts, family law attorney. Clarissa had introduced us once, briefly at a fundraiser. She'd said, "Zoe, if you ever need to navigate something with clarity, Elena's the one." At the time, I'd laughed. What would I need a lawyer for? Now, I finally understood. I texted her the next morning. "Elena, it's Zoe Holloway. I have a clause. I need to know how sharp it can cut." She responded in under 3 minutes. "Bring everything. Let's make it a scalpel." Elena's office sat at the edge of the business district, a sleek glass rectangle nestled between a gourmet coffee shop and an organic spa. The building looked like it had never seen a storm, like nothing chaotic had ever dared pass through its revolving doors. I arrived 10 minutes early, documents in hand, wearing the exact shade of navy Clarissa used to call courtroom blue. Elena met me in the lobby herself. No assistant, no pretense. She hugged me briefly, businesslike but sincere, then led me upstairs. Her heels clicked softly on the tile floor, confident, controlled. Her office was minimalist, furnished in whites and grays, with a single abstract canvas hanging behind her desk. No family photos, no distractions. Just a glass-top table, 2 leather chairs, and the law. I placed the folio on the table between us and watched her eyes flick across the seal on Clarissa's trust addendum. "Elena," I said quietly, "what I'm about to ask isn't about revenge." She didn't look up. "Of course not. It's about reclaiming something they never thought I had the right to want." Now she raised her eyes, and I saw the recognition, the shift from lawyer to advocate, from technician to strategist. "Then let's make them regret underestimating you," she said. I opened the folder. She read in silence for 5 full minutes. Occasionally her brow furrowed. Once, she let out a soft, "Huh," as if Clarissa had surprised even her from beyond the grave. When she finally closed the last page, she leaned back and laced her fingers together. "Zoe," she said, "this is a gift, I know, but it's also a minefield. If Charles gets wind of this before we file, he'll throw everything at you. Counterclaims, injunctions, false allegations. He'll try to bury you in legal sludge until you break." I nodded. "That's why I came to you." "Good," she said, "because we're not walking into this like victims. We're going in like architects, laying a foundation brick by brick, clause by clause." She pulled her laptop toward her, opened a new file, and began outlining our strategy. Her fingers moved with precision, typing faster than I could process. "We'll need notarized copies of every document. Originals go to a safety deposit box under your name only. 2 backup copies in separate locations. Scans on a drive with 2-factor authentication. One that Charles can't access, even if he hires someone to hack you." "I already have backups," I said. "Encrypted, cloud-based, passwords in dead drops. 1 flash drive with my college roommate in Arizona." Elena paused, smiled slightly. Clarissa really did choose well. I didn't respond. The lump in my throat made words feel dangerous. "We're also going to file your ownership claim with the Family Trust Administrator before they can initiate a formal challenge. That will trigger a mandatory pause on any property division until your claim is investigated. And the divorce papers Charles gave me? Unenforceable. Filed by a third party, Unsigned by your husband. Theater. Legal posturing. She tapped her screen. Now, about Ethan. Has he made any formal moves? No, he's waiting, letting his father do the dirty work. Typical. She shook her head. What Charles doesn't realize is that Ethan's passivity is going to cost them both. Every day he delays gives us time to build our narrative. What narrative? The truth, Zoe. That you weren't a gold digger. That you contributed to the estate. That Clarissa trusted you. That this wasn't a marriage of convenience, but of deliberate contribution. That you are the natural heir, not because of blood, but because of integrity. A tremor moved through me. The kind that comes not from fear, but from the realization that you're finally stepping into your own shadow and finding it powerful. Elena, I said, voice steady, I don't want the money. I want the home, the legacy, the thing they never imagined I'd fight for because they thought I didn't belong. She nodded slowly. Then we'll make sure you walk away with the title, and your dignity. And if we play this right, she leaned forward, you'll be their landlord. The following weeks moved with surgical precision. Elena filed the property claim with the trust administrator on the third Thursday of the month, just before the Holloways' quarterly family audit, which meant the entire financial committee would see the request. It caused a stir. I knew because Charles called Ethan that same night, and Ethan slammed the study door so hard, the hallway mirror vibrated. I didn't ask what was said. I didn't need to. By then, the household tension was as tangible as the scent of Clarissa's roses in the East Garden. Charles had started showing up more often, pretending to check on the staff, but really monitoring me. Ethan had grown colder, but also more careful. He stopped disappearing overnight, started showing up at dinners again. Damage control. I played my part perfectly. Charming, poised, harmless. But behind the scenes, I was documenting everything. Conversations, emails, financial transactions. I activated a screen recorder on Ethan's laptop, which still synced to our shared cloud. I watched his browsing history shift. Divorce forums, asset protection strategies, articles on how to exit gracefully from high-conflict marriages. High conflict, in this case, meant women who didn't go quietly. Meanwhile, I had a locksmith install a new safe in my studio, just beneath the floorboards, under the antique rug Clarissa had imported from Milan. Inside, I placed the notarized trust clause, scans of the Holloway family asset register showing my unpaid contributions, photos of me restoring the garden, planning charity events, hosting guests, and the final piece, a handwritten letter from Clarissa, a personal note I'd found in one of her old diaries, dated just 6 weeks before her death. Zoe, if you're reading this, then they've tried to erase you. Don't let them. The house is yours, not because of inheritance, but because you breathed life back into it. You made it warm again. I see the way Charles looks at you, calculating, dismissive. I saw it when I was younger too. It broke me. Don't let it break you. Fight differently. Fight smart. I've done what I could. The rest is yours to finish. I copied the letter, stored the original, and burned the copy in the garden fire pit the following night. Charles watched from the library window. Let him wonder. Let him worry. Let him realize the thing he feared most wasn't that I'd fall apart. It was that I might have been building something while they weren't looking. 3 weeks after Elena filed the ownership claim, the invitations went out. Cream-colored linen envelopes, gold foil calligraphy, hand-delivered by the same courier service the Holloways had used for generations. The annual Holloway Summer Garden Gala, a cornerstone of their social calendar, was being held on schedule at the mansion, with me listed as the host. Charles hadn't objected. He couldn't, not without raising questions. On paper, I was still Mrs. Zoe Holloway, still legally bound to Ethan, still a visible extension of the family. And the gala was as much about appearances as it was about alliances. But what Charles didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment those invitations left my hands, the gala stopped being about the Holloways. It became mine. The planning began immediately. I contacted a different florist, local, not the overpriced firm Charles insisted on. I changed the catering company to one run by a woman-owned business Elena had recommended. I redesigned the menu. I rewrote the program. I brought in a live quartet from the conservatory instead of the gaudy jazz band Ethan preferred. Every change was subtle, tasteful, undeniable. I thought we always used Northern Table catering, Ethan commented absently one evening, flipping through the event brief I'd left on the foyer table. They were booked, I replied smoothly. He didn't press. He rarely did anymore. Not since the documents had started surfacing in places he hadn't expected. His email, his desk drawer, his private folders, little reminders, breadcrumbs, warnings. The day of the gala, the mansion was unrecognizable, not in structure, but in spirit. Gone was the cold austerity of Charles's vision. In its place, warmth, elegance, color. Roses and lavender wound through wrought iron arches. Candlelight flickered along every pathway. The air smelled like summer and possibility. Clarissa's garden, my garden, had never looked more alive. Guests arrived in waves. The guest list carefully curated to include those who mattered and those who gossiped. Influential women from old families, reporters from lifestyle publications, board members from the Holloway Foundation. Everyone who had ever measured my worth in subtle glances and tighter smiles. I greeted them all with grace. "Zoe, darling, this is stunning," whispered Marjorie Blake, editor-in-chief of Vine and Manor. "You've outdone yourself. Thank you," I said, offering her champagne. "We wanted something more personal this year." "We?" she asked. I smiled. "Clarissa and I. I still use her notes for the garden layout. She had such impeccable taste. The name hung in the air like incense. No one dared speak against it. Clarissa was revered, a phantom matriarch whose approval lingered long after her passing. "Did you oversee the design yourself?" another guest asked, admiring the place cards arranged with pressed flowers. "Every detail," I said. Charles arrived late. Of course he did. He walked in like a man expecting reverence, wearing his usual midnight suit and the expression of someone deeply inconvenienced by celebration. He greeted donors, clapped a few backs, ignored me entirely. But I saw the pause in his stride when he noticed the banners at the west entrance. They read, "In loving memory of Clarissa Holloway, a celebration of growth, community, and legacy." The phrase had been chosen with surgical intent. Legacy, a word Charles held like currency. He caught up to me near the fountain, where the head of the Preservation Society was admiring the marble restoration I'd overseen last fall. "Zoe," Charles said, with that tight-lipped smile he reserved for cameras and necessary conversations. "Charles," I replied evenly. He waited until the guest moved on before leaning in. "This isn't what we discussed." "No," I said. "It's better." He glanced around. "You used Clarissa's name without permission." "She left me permission," I said. "In writing. Would you like to see it?" His jaw twitched. "I don't know what you think you're doing." "Celebrating her," I interrupted. "Elevating the legacy. Isn't that what this family's about? You're politicizing a social event, shifting alliances." "No," I said. "I'm hosting a garden party." Then I walked away, because this was no longer a performance. It was positioning. Power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was an ivy vine growing quietly up the side of a fortress, creeping in unnoticed until it was holding the structure together, or pulling it down. And tonight, the ivy had reached the top. As the night wore on, guests began to whisper, not maliciously, but with curiosity, about the changes, about my role, about the rumors they had heard, but hadn't dared ask. It started with the small things. A donor asked if I would be overseeing next year's gala. A board member of the foundation pulled me aside and said he'd love my opinion on the upcoming grant allocations. Marjorie asked for a quote for an article on modern women preserving historic estates, but it shifted when Ethan spoke, or tried to. He was already tipsy, 3 glasses of Pinot and too much attention from Marina, who floated in just long enough to make her presence known, then retreated like a shadow. He clinked his glass, called for attention, and raised a toast that began with, "To the enduring values of the Holloway legacy." But something in the crowd changed. Their eyes drifted. Their applause was polite but strained, because by then it was clear who had shaped the evening, who had chosen the music, the wine, the stories told, who had hosted. Ethan saw it too. His eyes locked on mine mid-sentence, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I saw it. Not contempt, but fear. He stumbled through the rest of his speech, and Charles didn't step in to save him. He was too busy watching the donors laugh at my table, too busy watching my name become currency. By the time the string quartet played the final song, the mansion was buzzing with a different energy. Not Holloway power, Zoe Holloway power. After the last guest left, I stood in the garden alone. The roses swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere inside, Ethan was likely sulking. Charles had disappeared, but I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about what came next, because this was no longer about survival. It was about sovereignty. And the woman they tried to erase had just rewritten the guest list, the narrative, and the future of the very ground they stood on. 3 days after the garden party, I found the first sign of Charles's retaliation, not in a letter or a confrontation, but in silence. The mansion's energy shifted again. Staff who once smiled reflexivamente now avoided eye contact. The chef, usually warm and chatty, gave curt replies. The estate manager, a man who'd worked here for 15 years, suddenly acted like I was a guest instead of the woman who'd been managing the property budget for the last 6. I noticed details, my calendar entries for upcoming renovations deleted from the shared estate file. The password to the financial dashboard changed without notice. My name was removed from the Garden Gala's official press release, all done quietly, strategically, as if I could be erased with just a few administrative clicks. I didn't panic. I documented everything, every alteration, every message, every unauthorized change. Elena had taught me that what matters isn't always what they take. It's how they try to make it look like it was never yours to begin with. This is phase 1, she said during our Monday morning call. They're testing boundaries, seeing how loudly they can act before you push back. And when I do? I asked. They'll escalate, but so will we. And the escalation came faster than I expected. That Wednesday, Ethan summoned me to the study with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for family deaths or tax audits. I walked in slowly, deliberately. He sat behind his father's desk like a child in costume, trying to fill a suit that didn't belong to him. His hands were folded. A folder lay on the desk. Ivory cardstock, gold trim. I didn't sit. You wanted to speak to me? He gestured to the folder. My father had a draft drawn up, a formalized property reassignment agreement. He thought it might help resolve things amicably. Amicably, I repeated. It's generous, Ethan said quickly. You keep the BMW, the jewelry, a cash settlement, enough to start over. Start over? I asked. As what? A woman who almost mattered? He flinched. I opened the folder and scanned the first page. They weren't even subtle. Language about non-marital contributions, dissolution of non-property holding spouse claims, and full transfer of inherited assets to primary bloodline beneficiaries. Illegal whitewashing. A blueprint for erasure. I closed the folder carefully and looked up. Did you even read this? Of course I did. Then you know it's garbage. Ethan bristled. Zoe, it doesn't have to get ugly. I smiled coldly. Ethan, it already is. You just haven't noticed the blood on your side of the table yet. He stood abruptly. This house was never yours. I stepped closer. Clarissa thought differently. She left receipts, and lawyers, and signatures. What have you got, Ethan? A folder your father handed you like a leash? His face flushed. I walked out without another word. Back in my studio, I opened the drawer beneath the safe and pulled out the second folder I'd prepared, a contingency Elena insisted we draft weeks ago. Inside, a counterproposal, one that included a declaration of inheritance rights under spousal trust inclusion, notarized witness statements of my contributions to estate management, and a psychological profile from a family therapist Clarissa and I had seen after her diagnosis, stating clearly that I had been her anchor and the most trusted emotional steward of her household. I scanned everything again, uploaded copies to 2 drives, sent Elena a text. They've started phase 2. Time to move the queen. Her response came 2 minutes later. Agreed. Let's file the injunction. By Friday, the petition was filed. A temporary freeze on all asset transfers and estate operations pending resolution of inheritance disputes. The court order arrived at the mansion via courier in a silver envelope. Charles was in the foyer when it was delivered. He opened it right there. I watched from the staircase, a ghost in burgundy silk. His eyes scanned the first page, and for the first time, his mask cracked, just slightly, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, the kind of subtle fracture only visible to someone who had studied him for years. He looked up slowly, met my gaze. I see you've learned how to weaponize sentiment. No, I said. I've learned how to defend it. He stepped closer. You won't win. I already have. You just haven't caught up yet. He left without a word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the stained glass. And that evening, I hosted the Foundation Scholarship Committee in the West Library. Originally, Charles had planned to chair it, but when the meeting began, all eyes turned to me. Charles said he had a conflict, one of the board members whispered, but I'm glad you're running point. Clarissa always said you had the best instincts for talent. The meeting lasted 2 hours. We voted on 3 scholarships, All went to young women pursuing fields Clarissa once championed: environmental design, historic preservation, and nonprofit legal advocacy. At the end, I pulled out Clarissa's handwritten quote from her 2013 foundation speech and read it aloud. "Legacy isn't what you pass down. It's what you build alongside others and trust them to continue when you're gone." There was silence, then applause. The back in my room. I opened the window and let the night air in. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat in the stillness and felt the mansion around me, not as a structure, but as a living thing, one that had tried to reject me, one that I had learned to nurture anyway, because I wasn't fighting for walls or windows. I was fighting for the truth, and the truth was, I hadn't married into the Holloway name. The Holloways had been absorbed into mine. They thought I didn't know. They always did. The illusion of secrecy had become a tradition for the Holloway men, a self-indulgent belief that if they whispered low enough or lied with enough condescension, their sins would evaporate into the marble and mahogany of the estate. But the walls had always heard, and now, so had I. The photos came on a Sunday morning. Anonymous envelope, no return address, postmarked downtown. Inside, 6 color-printed photographs: Marina, Ethan, a rooftop bar, a hotel lobby, an airport lounge, not posed, not stylized, surveillance. In the last photo, Ethan's hand rested on the small of her back. The gesture wasn't sexual. It was proprietary, like she was a possession, like I used to be. I laid the photos out across the kitchen island. The marble caught the reflection of Marina's smile, wide, teeth perfect, smug, in the way of women who thought youth alone made them invincible. But I wasn't angry. I was ready, because I had known, long before the emails, before the perfume I didn't own appeared on Ethan's collars, before the late meetings, before the passive withdrawal. Marina wasn't the threat. She was the pawn, and Ethan had just sacrificed her without realizing the queen had already crossed the board. On Monday, I scheduled a meeting with Elena and presented the photos, the envelope, and a printed email thread I had recovered from Ethan's deleted items folder. He'd forgotten that our shared home network backed up local storage to an off-site archive I had set up during our 2nd year of marriage. Ethan Holloway. 2. Marina C. She's not going to fight. She's passive-aggressive at worst. We'll have the house, the accounts, and the name by January. Just let my father handle the cleanup. Elena read the message, then lifted her gaze slowly. He's trying to bait you. I know. He wants you to react emotionally, file something impulsive, make a public scene. I won't. Elena leaned forward. Then let's make them make the mistake. Arnie, that mistake came the following Thursday, during the Foundation's quarterly mixer, another event originally chaired by Charles, but now co-hosted by me and the Trust's public relations officer. It was held at the Glass House Club downtown, a venue known for panoramic skyline views, overpriced wine, and subtle power plays. I wore black silk, minimal jewelry, Clarissa's diamond cufflinks repurposed as earrings. Ethan arrived 20 minutes late with Marina on his arm. She wore red, the kind of red that didn't whisper, but screamed. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Marina smiled like she'd already won. I smiled back like I'd read the final page. They made their way through the room, Ethan playing the disaffected host, Marina offering over-practiced laughs. She introduced herself as Ethan's associate from the firm, and more than one guest raised a brow. When they reached me, Ethan extended a glass of champagne like an offering. I took it. "Zoe," he said smoothly. "You remember Marina?" "Of course." I turned to her. "Though I hear you've been spending more time in the residential division than the executive suite lately." Her smile faltered. "Just helping with some transitions." "Ah," I said, sipping. "Transitions. Such delicate times. So easy to misplace things." Ethan shifted. "We're keeping things professional." "I'm sure you are," I said. "Just like when Charles drafted a property reassignment agreement without legal standing." He stiffened. Around us, the music continued. Laughter echoed. Wine glasses clinked. But the conversation had drawn the attention of 3 guests nearby, including a reporter from Estate Living Quarterly, a publication that worshipped the Holloway name. "Elena filed the motion to amend the trust documents last week," I said, loud enough for them to hear. "We've included correspondence, photos, financial transfers, and a timeline of interactions. It's quite the narrative." Marina's eyes widened. Ethan paled. I leaned in slightly, voice soft and sweet. You should have stuck with rooftop bars and anonymous lobbies. Private is safer. Public? That's mine now. That evening, after returning to the mansion, I found Ethan waiting in the conservatory. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just looked cornered. You humiliated me. No, I said, unwrapping the earrings. You did that to yourself. I just gave it context. You've weaponized everything, even my mother's death. I turned to him. Don't you dare invoke Clarissa. She gave me this house, this chance. You gave me a campaign. I can fight this. With what? I snapped. You let your father act like the kingmaker while you played the puppet. You gave me every tool I needed and assumed I'd never know how to use them. He crossed the room. You don't know everything. I know enough, I said. I know about the offshore account, the Cayman transfer, the consulting fees that don't have any consulting tied to them. I know what you've done with the foundation's discretionary budget. He froze. How? He whispered. I held up my phone. Every Holloway document is archived in triplicate. I had admin access for 6 years. You never changed it. He backed away slowly. This isn't a fight, I said. It's an autopsy. Later that night, I found Marina's name removed from the firm's public directory. Rumor spread that she had been placed on indefinite leave pending internal restructuring. The board cited conflict of interest, misuse of position, ethics review. All anonymous, of course. Elena's doing, no doubt. But Marina wasn't the enemy. She was a mirror, a reflection of who I could have been if I had kept quiet, if I had stayed small, if I had believed the lies whispered in marble halls and gaslit bedrooms. But I didn't. I broke the mirror, and the reflection that remained was my own. Sharp, certain, untouchable. Charles Holloway's first love had never been his wife, his son, or even his family name. It was reputation. Legacy to him wasn't about lineage. It was optics, endowments, editorials, the polished profiles in Heritage Capital Quarterly that used phrases like pillar of the community and an empire of integrity. He knew how to stage philanthropy like theater, so when I started receiving invitations with my name suddenly omitted, when the Holloway Foundation's board meeting was moved without my knowledge, when a whisper campaign emerged claiming I was unstable and misappropriating family trust funds, I knew exactly who was behind it.
Charles hadn't just resumed his war. He'd escalated it to the press. At first it was subtle, offhand comments in closed-door meetings. A concerned donor who asked if I was coping well with the strain of transition. A board member who quietly asked Elena if I had any documentation of mental health diagnoses, under the guise of protecting the foundation's reputation. That was the moment I knew Charles had grown desperate, because men like him didn't smear. They delegated the smearing, and he had just soiled his gloves. Elena called the next morning, tone clipped. They're trying to push for a vote to remove you from the foundation's advisory board. They can't, I said. They shouldn't, she corrected. But Charles is leveraging his old friendships. He's leaning on favors, digging for anything that makes you look unfit. Then we give them something else to look at. She paused. You're ready? I've been ready for weeks. The dossier had taken months to assemble. It lived on an encrypted drive, backed by Elena's firm and notarized for timestamp integrity. It wasn't a weapon. Not exactly. More like a spotlight, pointed precisely at every crack Charles had spent 3 decades concealing. It included financial records showing foundation funds funneled into side investments under shell companies, investments that conveniently aligned with Charles's personal portfolio, a signed witness statement from the estate manager who had been dismissed after discovering discrepancies in the 2018 audit, email threads between Charles and the treasurer of the Holloway Preservation Council discussing reclassifying historical site funds to cover private renovation expenses, a 2017 letter from Clarissa, never sent but preserved in her draft files, expressing concern over Charles's disregard for ethical boundaries in stewardship of charitable contributions, and the crown jewel, an audio recording of a closed-door conversation between Charles and his former accountant, discussing ways to soften tax filings using creative grant rounding. The accountant, now retired in Vermont, had agreed to a sworn affidavit after Elena promised legal shielding. His words, calm and precise, were devastating. He called it narrative accounting, the man had said perception was more valuable than precision. The board meeting was held on a Wednesday afternoon. It took place in the conference room of the Holloway Cultural Trust,
with 10 board members seated around a walnut table that gleamed under custom lighting. Charles stood at the head, flanked by Ethan, both dressed in navy suits like matching propaganda. I entered last, calm, alone, carrying a simple leather folio. Charles opened the meeting with practiced charm. We're here to discuss restructuring in light of recent instability. Our goal is to preserve the foundation's integrity. Let's speak plainly, I interrupted. You're trying to remove me from the board. A few members shifted uncomfortably. Zoe, Charles said smoothly, this isn't personal. No, I agreed. It's systemic. He blinked. I placed the folio on the table and opened it. I have here a dossier of financial anomalies traced directly to discretionary foundation accounts, misused grants, unregistered beneficiary transfers, statements from dismissed staff. And this, I clicked a small remote, and the room filled with Charles's voice. Rounded off. Who's going to question a donation that was a few zeros too generous on paper? People want heroes, not accountants. The silence was chemical. Every eye turned to Charles. He stood frozen, mouth slightly open. Ethan shifted, unsure whether to defend or flee. I'd like this submitted into the board record, I said. And I'd also like to formally request an independent audit of the past 10 years. One of the board members, a retired judge, spoke first. I think that's reasonable. Another nodded. Absolutely. Transparency protects us all. Charles finally spoke, low and bitter. You think this changes anything? It changes everything, I said, standing. Because up until now, your power came from fear, but now it's coming from review. But that night, Charles left the mansion. No announcement, no scene, just a terse message to Ethan, and the soft slam of a front door. Ethan remained, but his presence had changed. He no longer walked with entitlement. He moved like someone walking through a home that no longer recognized him. And for good reason, because the audit was only the beginning. The title transfer on the mansion was in final stages. Elena's legal team had confirmed it, pending only the formal expiration of the 30-day challenge window. And Charles had just spent his final week of that window trying to defame me instead of filing. Ch'ti. At dawn, I walked the garden. Clarissa's lavender bloomed along the path. The roses had deepened in color. The air smelled like old secrets coming clean. I paused by the fountain, the same one Charles had once installed as a symbol of permanence. I leaned down, trailed my fingers in the water. I'm not erasing your legacy, Charles, I whispered. I'm redefining it. And tomorrow, when the paperwork finalized, this mansion would stop being the Holloway estate. It would become Zoe's house. Legally, permanently, indisputably. It happened at 10:04 a.m. on a Friday morning. The courthouse clerk didn't realize what she was handing me. Just another manila envelope. Just another transfer of title in a city where wealth changed hands behind closed doors and family empires shifted with the stroke of a pen. But for me, that envelope meant everything. It meant the fight was over. It meant the estate on 68 Sylvan Hill Road, once filed under Holloway Real Estate Holdings LLC, was now officially and irrevocably registered under a new entity, ZH Foundation for Historical Preservation owner, Zoe Holloway, trustee and sole beneficiary. It was done, and not even Charles could undo it. He had let the 30-day challenge window lapse, too entangled in his campaign of character assassination to realize the clock had been running. By the time his lawyers tried to contest it, the judge had already reviewed Clarissa's trust addendum, the forensic accounting, and the evidence Elena and I had compiled. He didn't just lose the house, he lost the game. Back at the mansion, the light looked different. Not literally. Sunlight still spilled through the bay windows in the grand salon, catching on the chandelier like a crown of glass. But something had shifted. The house felt awake, like it had exhaled for the first time in years. I wandered the halls alone that morning, barefoot on the polished oak, passing the portraits Charles had commissioned to remind everyone of his lineage. I stopped in front of the largest one, him in a navy three-piece suit, Clarissa seated beside him, eyes distant. He'd hung it above the main staircase for maximum visibility. I stared at it for a long time. Then I called the art restoration company and had it removed. It wasn't destruction. It was curation. Clarissa deserved her own space, her own identity, separate from the man who'd controlled the narrative for too long. I had her portrait restored and rehung in the East Study, surrounded by the botanicals she once painted in watercolor and pressed between pages of her journals. That room became hers, not a memorial, but a reclamation. At noon, The staff gathered in the atrium. I'd sent out the message myself. Cordial, professional, brief. Please join me for a brief update regarding estate operations. They came slowly, cautiously. A few whispered as they entered. No one knew what to expect. Since Charles's departure and Ethan's slow dissolution into irrelevance, the household had existed in limbo. I stood at the foot of the grand staircase, clipboard in hand, documents signed and sealed. "Thank you for coming," I began. "I won't keep you long. As of this morning, ownership of the estate has officially transferred to the ZH Foundation for Historical Preservation." A ripple of reaction moved through the group. Surprise. Relief. One or two visible sighs of finally. "Your contracts remain unchanged," I continued. "Your benefits remain intact. But from today forward, we will be operating under a different model, one centered on transparency, sustainability, and respect." I saw the estate manager, Mr. E. Bellamy, who had worked here under 3 generations of Holloways, lower his clipboard slightly, eyes wide. "I know many of you were unsure where your loyalties belonged these last few months," I said, "and I don't blame you. It's hard to serve a house when the people in it are at war with each other." A pause. "But the war is over, and if you're still here, you're part of something new." A quiet, firm voice rose from the back. "And Mr. Holloway?" I smiled gently. "No longer has authority on this property. Effective immediately." There was no applause, just a silence heavy with closure, and a few heads that nodded, slowly, like the house itself was nodding too. And that night, I stood alone in the formal dining room, lighting candles one by one, not because anyone was coming, but because I could. Because for the first time in 7 years, I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to light the good candles, to set the table with the real china, to walk into a room and not wonder if my presence would be deemed a disturbance or a disappointment. The mansion was mine now, but more than that, it was finally home. I sat at the head of the table where Charles had once conducted business dinners and power plays. I poured a glass of red wine. I set out a plate of roasted vegetables and saffron rice. A quiet meal, a soft victory. And across from me, in the empty seat Clarissa once occupied, I placed a photo of her, taken before her illness, before the layers of grief dimmed her expression. In the photo, she was smiling. Free, I raised my glass, to the woman who saw me when no one else did. The candlelight flickered in her glass frame, as if she nodded back. Till Maatha Thank 3 days later, I sent out a new round of invitations. Same cream linen, same gold trim, but this time, the envelopes bore a new monogram. Not a Holloway crest, just a simple ZH. The event was titled Reclamation, a Celebration of Place and Purpose, hosted by Zoe Holloway, at the historic Holloway House, now ZH Estate. It was part relaunch, part press event, part public exhale. Everyone came. Donors, journalists, friends. Even a few skeptics who had aligned with Charles during the campaign to discredit me. And they saw it. The new garden layout, inspired by Clarissa's original sketches. The guest suite converted into a community artist residency. The gallery wall featuring women who had once served this house, maids, cooks, gardeners, now remembered by name and photo. I gave a short speech. Nothing boastful, just clear. This house once belonged to a name, I said. Now it belongs to a purpose. I let the words hang, then added, and to the people who believed it was worth preserving, not just in architecture, but in intention. They clapped, not politely, not out of obligation, but because they understood, because something had happened that day. The house had chosen, not a man, not a dynasty, but a woman who had once stood at its door with a suitcase and a hopeful smile, unaware of the storm ahead. And now, she stood at the top of its staircase with the keys in her hand. And that afternoon, the light in the library seemed both softer and sharper. Soft, because the sun filtered through the aged stained glass, casting colored patterns on the Persian rug. Sharp, because every shadow felt possible revelation. I gathered the last of the legal papers we needed. The final judgment confirming title transfer, the audit report, the affidavit from the estate manager, and a concise chronology of every offense: gaslighting, financial deceit, betrayal. They were laid out in a neat stack before me. I looked at my reflection in the large glass window behind the desk. Zoe Holloway, standing where Clarissa once sat in pictures. I took a steadying breath. Ethan arrived just after 5, His footsteps echoed in the hallway. I heard his keys drop on the hall table, then felt his presence before I saw him. Uneasy, caught between expectation and regret. He stood at the threshold of the library. I gestured to the chair across from me. "You asked to speak," I said. He nodded, not moving to sit. "I need you to understand a few things," he began, voice low. I closed the folder. The folders. Put away the affidavit, the audit, the email threads. No theatrics. I raised my hands, palms up. A surrender, almost. But it's what I needed him to see. "Go ahead," I said. He swallowed. "You've changed everything. Legally, socially. People see you differently now." "Yes," I said. "I hope they see clearly now." There was a long pause. He hardened. "My father, I thought this was all necessary. For the family. For our name." "For what name, Ethan?" I asked. "The Holloway name built on secrets, silences, and selective memories?" His face faltered. "You know that's not true." But I did know. The receipts. The trust addendum. Clarissa's letter. How she tried to warn me. How she tried to warn him. But he didn't listen then. He doesn't get to challenge history now. I stood, walked to the French doors that opened onto the garden. The roses were in bloom, trimmed, alive. Clarissa's lavender still saturated the breeze. "See this garden?" I said. When I arrived, it was overgrown, neglected. It was falling apart in places people didn't often look. But I repaired it, piece by piece. I paid for contractors who worked quietly. Had plants shipped from nurseries he claimed too expensive. I gave it summers of work. Blood, sweat, many sleepless nights. He shifted. "You did all that?" "I did." He closed his eyes for a moment. I saw regret. Shame? I couldn't tell. "I thought you would break," he said softly. I turned back to face him. The sun was lowering behind him, casting his silhouette long. "You were wrong," I said. "What you didn't understand is that I never broke. I built. While you were busy arranging your exit strategy, I was building mine." Another silence. He approached. He lifted a single finger, as if to touch the papers on my desk. "This is overkill," he said. I shook my head. "This is necessary, because you believe that if you stripped me of everything, title, reputation, influence, you could erase me." He didn't respond. "You can't erase roots," I continued. "You can't erase evidence. You can't erase Clarissa's intentions. Those seeds were planted long ago, Ethan. What you and your father didn't expect is that I would tend to them." And he stood still, inches away. I could hear his breath, the scent of cologne mixed with lingering bitterness. "You could have stayed," he said, voice cracking. "We could have made things easier." "Would that have been genuine, Ethan?" I asked. "Or just another performance?" He swallowed again. "I don't know. It's too late for what ifs," I told him. "The truth doesn't need revision, and I don't need someone who regrets standing in the shadows." He nodded once, slowly, like a man coming to terms with acute loss. "I'm proud of you," he said, voice low. "I'm sorry." And then he left. "Destobat amor." I closed the door behind him and leaned against the dark wood for a long moment. The silence of the house felt different now, heavier with finality, but also lighter with release. The walls I had imagined closing in now felt like wings lifting me. That evening, alone in the drawing room, I lit the fireplace. The flame flickered, warm. I poured a glass of wine, deep Merlot, Clarissa's favorite. I looked through the window as dusk deepened. The roses dimmed in the twilight. The silhouettes of the garden statues stretched long. The sky turned a bruised purple. The little things I had done, planting, restoring, preserving, they looked more intentional now. Not just beauty, but testimony. I raised my glass to the possibility of peace, to the strength found in truth, to the woman who inherited not because she asked, but because she earned. Because ownership is more than possession. It's integrity. It's legacy. And in the hush of that library, with dust motes dancing in firelight, I felt, finally, at home. And the phone starts ringing early, before sunrise, when the sky is still wet with stars, and the hush of the mansion feels like its own heartbeat. I let it ring once, then twice, and finally pick it up, turning on the bedside lamp. It's a local reporter's number. "Ms. Holloway? Zoe Holloway?" "Yes." "We're doing a story about the recent transfer of ownership of the Holloway estate. Residents in the county are talking. Some are concerned about how this will affect taxes, local funding, heritage tourism. Would you be open to a quote?" I pause, Sit up in the bed, wine-colored sheets rustling. I stare at the phone. Think of the candled halls, the glossy floors, the perfumes of gardenias and old wood. Think of Charles and Ethan, the way each had pretended I was invisible until I wasn't. Think of every handwritten letter, every ledger, every photo. Think of Clarissa. Yes, I say. I'll meet you in the library in 1 hour. When I open the library door, the scent of junipers from the garden drifts inside. The reporter waits by the window. There's a recorder in her hand, a notebook, a faint look of something like respect, maybe even wariness. I sit. She asks the usual. So, Ms. Holloway, what made you decide to claim the estate so publicly? I lean back, choose my words softly, precisely. I didn't decide this morning, I say, or yesterday. I decided years ago, when I realized caring for this house meant more than preservation. It meant accountability. She nods, pen poised. The community deserves the truth, I continue, because every stone in this mansion, every rose, every doorframe, carries a history, not just of wealth and legacy, but of responsibility. She asks about Charles's response, about rumors of financial mismanagement, about whether the foundation's donors are staying or pulling out. I tell her what they can verify, what's documented, the trust addendum, the audit, the witness statements, the recording between Charles and the accountant. Yes, people are questioning, and yes, I believe they should. Because if transparency is scary for some, maybe that's how you know you're doing something right. The article runs 2 days later. Front page, new owner, new direction. Zoe Holloway becomes public steward of Holloway Estate. Subheading, charitable donors react. Advisor board reorganized. Charles's statement is brief and cold. He says the community should expect continuity, not change, that the foundation will honor its past, even as it moves forward under Zoe's leadership. I watch him walk across the marble hall, glare masked by civility. Social media picks it up. Photos of the gala, quotes from the libraries, clips of garden roses, people outside the county center, protesting tax relief or arguing zoning issues. A few nasty comments, a few heartfelt ones. Someone writes, "About time that house meant something more than just a name." Texts come in, from friends, from people I used to consider distant, from women who had been volunteers, who helped plan events, who sewed curtains, who hung paintings behind the scenes. "Congratulations. You deserve this. Thank you." Ethan messages, "We need to talk." I don't respond. Charles sends an invitation to a donor luncheon. "To heal the past," he writes. I RSVP yes, but not out of kindness, out of completeness. At the luncheon, the room smells of polished oak and hush, a soft hum of small talk and silver cutlery. They've arranged tables under white canopies on the terrace, wine glasses glinting in late afternoon sun. Donors seated around me, some who once aligned with Charles, some who stayed neutral, some who avoided every event, until suddenly there was a new table set in my name. A tall woman in silk and pearls, head of one of the largest family trusts in the region, catches my eye. She stands. "Zoe," she says, voice clear, "I want to publicly apologize. I didn't believe you could carry this burden. I thought the foundation needed a man, a Holloway. I see now how wrong I was." Applause ripples across the terrace. I breathe, lean forward, let the moment settle. "Thank you," I say, because the foundation never needed a name. It needed purpose. It needed honesty. It needed someone who was willing to build and heal, not just command. That night, I sit in my studio, watch as the mansion's silhouette pools against moonlight. I open a letter, hand-delivered, cream paper, Charles's handwriting. "Zoe, you've changed more than the ownership. You've shifted the foundation of this house. I misjudged you, not your strength, not your purpose. Maybe when one building is meant to last centuries, they forget its strength must come from every brick, every small hand that cared. I will never stop contesting everything we built, but I cannot deny what you are making this place become. For Clarissa, for truth, for the people. CH. I fold it. Keep the pen stroke visible. Save the envelope. It's not exactly an apology, not a confession, but it's real. When the sun rises the next day, it looks sharper. The roses look brighter. The mansion feels settled, like a breathing thing. I step outside, let the breeze catch my dress. I breathe it all in, the power, the duty, the joy. In the mirror of the fountain, I see a face both familiar and changed. Stronger, not hollowed. I realize ownership is more than property. It's narrative. It's who gets to tell the story through hallways and gardens and dinner invitations. And I, Zoe Holloway, will be the one writing it from here on out. A morning came with promise. I woke before the sun, pale lavender light filtering through my new curtains. No drafts, no echoes of Charles's footsteps, just the soft tick of the wall clock and, finally, peace. But as Elena always warned me, peace is fragile. It's what happens when one side believes the fight is over, that the victory is sealed. I answered my phone in the kitchen, holding a mug of strong coffee. The voice on the other side was tight, not quite angry, but alarmed. Zoe. It was Mr. Bellamy, the legacy estate manager. We have a problem. The accountants flagged something in the recent audit. Cash flow irregularities from the Holloway Historical Trust. Some fund transfers are missing documentation. Some endowment disbursements are under review. The bank called, wanting to freeze certain accounts pending verification. The breath I didn't take stayed out. My heart hammered. Which accounts? I asked. One is the maintenance fund for the East Wing. Another is the donor endowment for the community artist residency. Also, there's a pending invoice from a vendor that's gone missing in their system. Seems legitimate, but paperwork is off. I thanked him and hung up. For a moment, I stood there in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hand, the scent of roasted beans mingling with something like dread. Was this Charles's doing? Or had something slipped through the cracks? In the rest of the day moved like walking on glass. I met Elena in her polished conference room first. I explained. She frowned. Trouble with frozen accounts can be serious, but we've fortified everything, right? Dual ledgers, backups, evidence, trust modifications. Yes, I said. But I didn't expect someone to attack the financial health rather than the legal title. She leaned in. That's what makes this next level. Subtle. Strategic. If they freeze your funds, disrupt donor confidence, they can compromise operations, create fear, undermine you internally. I closed my eyes, thinking of the gardens, of the gala, of every polished speech I gave. This was a test, one I didn't ask for, but I also knew I couldn't cower now. When I returned to the mansion and headed to the library, where the vault of financial ledgers waited, I unlocked the cabinet, pulled files. I found the missing invoices, cross-checked vendor correspondences. Some paperwork was indeed missing. Emails with attachments hadn't been archived properly. A clerk had misfiled receipts, and some spending approvals hadn't been signed. Not disasters, but enough to make someone with ill intent smell weakness. I spent hours rebuilding the paper trail, document by document, logged every transaction, photocopied every email, created digital records where once only paper existed, backed up everything to encrypted drives, sent copies to Elena, sent another copy to a trusted auditor we retained, telling him to prepare an independent report of the financial discrepancies. Well, that night, a donor called. A voice on the other end asked carefully, Ms. Holloway, I saw the notice that some funds are under scrutiny. I just need reassurance that the artist residency isn't in jeopardy. I didn't panic. I said, thank you for calling. Yes, everything is under review. I've initiated an independent audit. The residency is operating as normal. Your contribution is protected. Transparency is our priority. There was silence in the line, then, good. Thank you, Zoe. I hung up and sat by the window, looking over the east garden. The roses glowed in moonlight. The scent of lavender was thick, and I realized legitimacy was more fragile than law, trust, more delicate than title. And the next morning, Charles called. He sounded cautious. No anger, no threats, curious. Zoe, he said, I heard about the audit, the frozen accounts. I hope this isn't going to become a spectacle. It won't, I said evenly. We're addressing everything. Because if donors lose faith, you know how fast things crumble. Then let them see that what you always called my weakness, my attention to detail, the insistence on proof, is the very reason things stand. Because I built foundation not on your illusions, but on evidence. There was a long silence. I could imagine him pacing in his study, imagining propping up walls that were already tilting. When he spoke again, it was softer. Be careful, Zoe. And I hung up, feeling more centered than threatened. I had anticipated war, and this was one of its sharper arrows. But it didn't pierce. It awakened something else. Later that night, I organized a meeting with the full leadership team of the foundation and estate: project directors, garden maintenance, donor relations, financial officers. I showed them the issues: missing invoices, the freezes, review letters. I showed them the audit in progress, the independent reviewer engaged, the legal protections in place. I didn't accuse anyone. I just shared truth. I want you to know, I said. This house is not safe when its housekeeper is afraid. Not safe when its gardener is uncertain. Its artist worried. We protect not because we must, but because integrity requires it. Almost every face in the room held something new. Relief, pride, renewed loyalty. Because we weren't hiding. We were building. Yet in bed, later, I thought about the past weeks. The light shifting in hallways, Charles's murmurings, Ethan's regret. The frozen accounts were only one battle, not the war. This house, Clarissa's design, my reclamation, is stronger than bureaucracy, stronger than rumors, stronger than fear. I closed my eyes and allowed emotion to settle, not like a wound, but like a seed, to grow. Tomorrow morning, I would respond publicly, hold a press conference, show donors, supporters, journalists the facts, not just what has been done, but how it's being done, honestly, transparently, with respect. Because true ownership isn't just proving law, it's upholding trust. Linorum. In the morning air was crisp and clear, the kind that turns the edges of things sharp and alive. I arrived at the mansion's front courtyard by 9:30 a.m., dressed in charcoal gray silk, pearls that once were Clarissa's, hair pulled back in a low, deliberate chignon. The portico was bathed in late morning light. Reporters pressed their cameras behind velvet ropes. Microphones stood ready on podiums draped in navy cloth with the ZH Foundation for Historical Preservation emblem. Elena arrived beside me, carrying the bound independent audit report, the finalized ownership decree, and copies of witness affidavits. She placed them on the podium as I gave her a faint nod. The staff, gardeners, housekeepers, financial officers, stood discreetly behind the men and women in press, a quiet wall of witnesses. Asuasor. I stepped up to the podium. The microphones caught my heels clicking across marble. A hush fell. Thank you all for coming, I said, voice steady. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them lean forward. My name is Zoe Holloway. Until recently, many stories were told about this house, about who it belonged to, and who deserved to call it home. I pulled the decree from the stack, held it, letting sunlight glint off the decorative seal. Today, I stand before you as the confirmed legal owner of the property known historically as the Holloway Estate, now under the stewardship of the ZH Foundation for Historical Preservation. Camera shutters clicked. Reporters scribbled. I realize this moment may be confusing or even painful for some, I continued, especially those who believed my presence here was provisional. I allowed a small smile, not triumphant, but calm. To them I say, this is not out of spite. This is out of justice, out of truth. I laid out the issues plainly, the audit findings. I explained that the independent audit, which began when questions about fund allocation arose in Chapter 11, confirmed financial irregularities spanning several years, misclassified expenses, missing vendor approvals, misleading accounts between foundation and personal property work. Clarissa's intentions. I read a short excerpt from Clarissa's private addendum, the trust clause, her letter, witness statements. These documents are not accidents, I said. They were written, preserved, and invoked precisely because this property, this legacy, was never meant to be controlled by fear or legacy alone. Transparency measures. I announced that the foundation would publish annual reports, open its ledgers for donor review, and establish a community advisory board to oversee philanthropic and restoration projects. Someone in the reporter's row shouted, "Why not just sell and walk away?" I answered, "Because a home is more than real estate. It's the heartbeat of a family's story, our story, built over sweat, choices, love, and candid truth. I cannot build anything strong on shame or silence." And then the questions came. Q. Mr. Holloway released a statement last night saying this is a betrayal. What do you make of that? A. I would have hoped for clarity and honesty, but I know betrayal is often the final refuge of the unjust. Q. Does this mean you no longer want any relationship with your family? A. Family is complicated. Rights and duty may be tied by blood, but legacy, respect, and truth are built. I intend to maintain what was good, what could have been good, but no more false gestures, no more erasure. Q. Will this affect the Foundation's donors? A. I believe it will strengthen them. Those who give do not give to uncertainty. They give to purpose, to trust, to people who don't hide their records behind walls. I want every donor, every volunteer, every gardener to feel that they are part of something honest, not something polished for perception. Sami normal. Afterward, as the reporters drifted away, I stepped off the dais. Elena caught my arm. You held their attention, she said quietly. You made them listen when they weren't sure it was your turn to speak. I nodded, still breathing slower than a few minutes ago. My pulse steadied. Around me, the estate grounds felt different. The fountains seemed to reflect more sunlight. The roses seemed fuller. The mansion walls looked less like barriers and more like pages of a reopened book. Then Ethan approached. He stood a few paces away, watching, with restraint, maybe regret. You did well, he said. I looked at him. Thank you. He hesitated. I'm proud of what you've built. I nodded. No forgiveness, no invitation, just acknowledgement. Sometimes that's enough. Jan, Khan that night, the headlines came. Zoe Holloway's takeover, a new chapter for the Holloway estate. Audits reveal what many suspected. Legacy not always clean. ZH Foundation promises transparency. Community reacts positively. Some editorials praised. Others questioned motives. But mostly, people were talking about me. Not as Ethan's wife or Charles's daughter-in-law, but as Zoe Holloway, an entity of her own making. When I walked the garden under the silver moon, Elena beside me, I felt the weight of expectations shift. My shoulders were straighter, my hands steadier. The mansion, once a battleground of whispers, had become a stage of clarity. And I realized, victory is not just what the law records, it's what the world recognizes. Morning came like a slow reveal, pale light sifting through curtains, dust motes dancing in the beams, the roses outside embroidered in dew. But I sensed something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. There was a message waiting on my phone. Please call right away. Surgery. It was from my younger sister, Lily. The call shook me. Zoe, I just got diagnosed, she said, voice tight. It's the kind of tumor they can't promise benign. My heart seized. Lily was always the strong one, the one who laughed loudest, cared fiercest, the one who believed in me when everyone else treated me like I was pretending to belong. Has the doctor? I asked, trying not to choke. Not yet. Biopsy tomorrow. But I wanted you to know. Wanted you to come. I swallowed, feeling the floorboards tilting. The home I'd rebuilt. The battles I'd won. They seemed so urgent now. But life reminded me that some storms you don't plan for. I called Elena immediately. Zoe, take the afternoon, she said. We can put off anything non-essential. I'll handle what needs handling here. I thanked her. I packed a bag, caught a flight, and by evening I was at Lily's side in the hospital. The antiseptic smell, the soft beeping monitors, the fluorescent lights that exaggerate every shadow. Lily was weaker than I remembered. The power of her smile was still there, but fatigue rounded her eyes. She took my hand, her skin cool. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't want this to happen, and you still had so much on your plate. I squeezed her hand. You're not a burden, I said. You're the reason I fight. Tears burned behind my eyes, because she deserved this moment of peace, of power, just as I had finally gained mine. Returning home the next day, I felt the mansion differently. Not like a fortress, but like a map of priorities. The walls that once felt like thresholds in a war now felt like guardians. The roses outside, the marble, the fabrics, details that once served strategy, now served solace. Back in town, I settled in front of my desk, trying to align schedules. Elena called with financial updates. Everything was stable. Donor confidence held, bank freezes had been responded to. The press had largely framed things as already moved. But in the back of my mind, Lily's diagnosis rippled out, turning strategy into something more fragile. And that night, I attended a gathering of the foundation board via video call. I couldn't travel because I needed rest, and I made a decision. Board, I said, voice softer than usual. I'd like to allocate part of the Holiday Artist Residency Fund to establish a health fund for caregivers and family members of residents, and another small endowment specifically for cancer research. especially brain tumors and early detection. There was silence, then applause. Many nodded. Elena smiled at me, proud. Others looked uncertain, consulting ledger pages. I continued, because leadership isn't just about ownership. It's about what you build in times when the foundation feels secure and when it feels vulnerable. Later, alone in the main bedroom, I stood by the mirror and looked at myself. I saw more than just the version of me that fought for title and justice. I saw my sister's reflection, my mother's, Clarissa's, all the women whose stories had woven this moment. I touched my hand to the mirror's cool glass. Voices of doubt whispered in my mind. Did I do enough? Was I enough? Could I protect both my dream and my family? But beneath that uncertainty, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Because while I cannot control illness, its unfairness, its fear, I can choose response. And tonight, I chose love, anchored in action. In the next morning, I flew back home. The mansion greeted me with its familiar echoes. The fountains ripple, the hallways hush, the olive tree in the courtyard casting long shadows. Ethan met me at the driveway. He looked tired. Guilt, maybe. Concern, definitely. Lily's, I said when he opened the passenger door. I heard, he replied. I'm sorry. I nodded. Thank you. There was no greeting, no blame, just two people living with consequence. He asked quietly, how can I help? For the first time in a long while, I didn't have an answer crafted for public consumption. No strategy, just what felt right. Could you help me finish Lily's garden? She's always wanted roses around her window. He nodded. A life doesn't pause for courts or titles or headlines. It demands tenderness, even when you've been hardened. That night, Lily's garden bed was fenced off from the wind. New rose bushes planted. Soil turned rich and dark. The gardener brought in packets of lavender she loves. Seeds sown for wildflowers she said she remembered from our childhood. We worked together under strings of garden lights. Hands muddy, breath short. She looked at the new garden, at the roses in bloom, at the lamps hung softly overhead. It's beautiful, she said. You made it ours. I touched her cheek. It is. Inged. In the weeks that followed, Lily got her diagnosis. Malignant, but treatable. Chemotherapy scheduled. Uncertainties ahead, but also small victories. Friends visited. Her laughter returned in fits. She declared the rose garden my favorite project yet. Through the treatments, I flew back and forth between the mansion, meetings, hospital rooms. Every document I signed, every donor call I made, every speech I gave felt different now. Less about power, more about promise. Less about proving, more about protecting. And in the quiet moments, when I felt tired, I remembered. Clarissa didn't write her clauses and trust addendums just for titles. She wrote them for legacy, for love, for the quiet assurance that someone would care deeply, that someone would not yield when confronted with injustice. So I did not yield. Because home is not just a building. Home is the collection of hearts that need you to be there. And tonight, as I sit in Lily's garden, roses glowing under moonlight, I finally understand. Strength is not just how loudly you can defend. Sometimes it's how quietly you hold beauty in the storm. Takunam. It was early dawn when the tremor first hit. Not the ground, but the heart of everything I had built. A phone call from Ethan. His voice was thin, concerned. Zoe, there's a situation with the trust's operating account. Something unexpected. I braced, already feeling the hollow echo of worry. By mid-morning, I was back at the mansion. The estate manager, Mr. Bellamy, met me in the gallery, letter in hand. His face was grave, the sort of look refined by years of decrees and hushed negotiations, but unsettled. They performed an asset freeze, he said. My chest tightened. Which account? He flicked the pages. The operating account. It funds the day-to-day maintenance, utilities, staff wages, guest services. Also, the reservation fund for the preservation tours. Some donor funds earmarked for immediate restoration. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining the lights going dim, the gardens untended, the fountains drying out. Not because the property was in my name, but because control without liquidity is power, without breath. I called Elena. Her voice was steady on speaker. How bad? I asked. Temporary freeze, she said. Court order to prevent dissipation of funds until the dispute can be heard. Likely initiated by your father-in-law's legal team. They want the control of narrative. They want to paint you as someone mismanaging the house. I exhaled slowly. Can we lift it? We can petition, she said. We can show financial statements, recent audits, everything we promised at the press conference. But we'll also need to show a need for access, proof that the freeze is hurting operations and people, that the foundation cannot function under this freeze. That latter piece, that proof, became my immediate mission. I spent the next hours gathering employee payroll statements, vendor contracts, incoming donation commitments, utility bills due, a sick gardener's medical needs, the artist residency's rent to be paid. I compiled a report, Impact of Asset Freeze on ZH, Foundation Operations, annexed to a legal petition, supported by affidavits, notarized statements, even photos of needing repairs on the West Wing's roof. Elena filed the motion. This freeze must be considered causing irreparable harm, not just financial, but cultural, emotional, communal. The trust is not just a legal entity, it is a custodian of legacy, of public good, of stories belonging not only to one family, but to all who invested in what the mansion had come to represent. While the motion circulated, rumors started anew. Headlines: Legal battle resumes over Moore's of family estate. What Zoe know and what she doesn't. Holloway estate's future in doubt amid frozen accounts. Ethan's name appeared in statements from Charles's lawyer. Zoe is overextending, misallocating funds, creating unnecessary publicity. Gratitude turned to gossip. Some donors paused check endorsements. Some staff whispered of pay delays, but I held steady. I invited the staff to a brief meeting in the east parlor, the afternoon sun flattering the restoration work I'd done on the windows. I looked them in the eyes. This freeze is not a defeat, I told them. It's a symptom. It means our foundation matters, that the legacy is real, and that what we do here, light, restoration, community, is no longer invisible. There were anxious faces. A gardener, Mrs. Davis, asked softly, "Will we still be paid?" "Yes," I said. "We are prioritizing payroll above all. I won't let anyone who works in these halls go without because of politics." Applause. Shy but warm. Relief, the kind that sells you strength in smaller increments than headlines ever will. On that night, in the drawing room, I sat with Elena reviewing the case status. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "We should know within a week whether the court issues a temporary lift, or at least signs off some funds for essentials." I nodded. "Let's prepare a public update." The next morning, I issued a statement. Calm, firm. The mansion remains open for scheduled tours. Staff continues to be paid on time. Restoration work is ongoing, though minor projects may be delayed. Donors are thanked, their contributions honored. Transparency remains the foundation of everything we do. Media coverage again came, some skeptical, some supportive. But this time, when the Preserve Chronicle asked for an interview, I accepted. I spoke clearly about the freeze, about its effect, about why the emotional bond people have with the estate matters, how a house is only as strong as its caretakers, its volunteers, its legacy, its connection with the community. People responded. Letters, messages, small gifts of support, roses, books, handwritten notes. Not enough to erase the tension, but enough to remind me that I was not marching this fight alone. And then days later, the court granted a limited emergency access order. They allowed enough funds released to keep staff paid, maintain essential utilities, electric, water, security, proceed with ongoing restoration projects that had no alternate funding timeline, ensure safety and preservation, roof leak repairs, structural integrity. It wasn't full freedom, but it was recognition. When the ruling came, I stood outside the courthouse with Elena. The sun was high, the courthouse steps in shadow. Reporters, photographers, cameras. Ethan was there too, standing off to the side, quiet. I let Elena read the motion aloud. Given the evidence of irreparable harm to operational integrity, the asset freeze hereby lifted partially, subject to oversight. Interim access to designated accounts granted to the plaintiff with fiduciary responsibility. A cheer of sorts from the crowd. A cautious exhale. I faced the cameras, felt the weight of every pair of eyes. "This isn't victory," I said. "It's a first breath after a small storm. But it's also proof, truth upheld, duty recognized, trust respected." And just then, far across the street, the mansion's fountain gurgled in harmony with the wind. The roses swayed. The ivy I'd tended crept along stone, alive, indomitable. I realized then, The foundations trembled, yes, but they did not crack. Tiamonkinayana. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the old courtroom, warming the marble sills, casting long shadows that felt like witnesses themselves. I sat beside Elena, hands clasped, heart steady, while outside the court filing room, reporters paced, cameras raised, whispers electric in the air. This was the final hearing. The moment when all of the legal battles, the emotional scars, the nights of doubt and evidence gathering would converge in a single voice, the judge's. The judge was a woman in her late 60s, her hair white but her posture still rigorous, her gaze sharp. She presided from a bench carved with symbols of justice, scales, oak branches, guardian faces. She looked at each of us, Charles to my left, Ethan more distant, Elena holding side documents, me with all the weight of every promise I dared make. Charles's lawyers spoke first, with practiced formality, arguing for reversal of the partial access order, a recount of disbursement, suggesting the audit process was flawed, that I'd mischaracterized documents, that donor confidence was eroding because of my public pronouncements. They tried to argue that the foundation's mission was being compromised by what they called performative exposure. Elena responded, measured. She walked through every document in the dossier, audited ledgers, independent verification, metadata timestamps on emails, sworn statements, Clarissa's trust addendum. She showed how, under Mr. Holloway's control, funds for charitable works had been diverted, how proper procurement protocol was ignored, how employee contracts were delayed. She showed that transparency wasn't a show, it was a repair, and I watched, not speaking, because everything she said echoed something I'd already lived. The nights alone in the study, the receipts in Clarissa's folder, the letters she left, the gardens I'd slept beside, the promise I had insisted upon. After closing arguments, the judge paused, reviewed her notes. She asked me a few direct questions. Ms. Holloway, can you assure this court that under your oversight, donor funds will be protected with external audit, with clear oversight? I nodded firmly. Yes, I will. And I can show you the protocol already in place. Dual trustee oversight, publicly disclosed financial summaries, donor earmarking cleaned up, a community advisory board whom donors know personally. She asked Charles a couple of questions, about specific line items, about authorizations under past audits, about his knowledge of Clarissa's trust addendum. He looked uncomfortable, his responses defensively clipped. Then came her decision. Her voice had gravity. After considering all the evidence, this court finds that the trust addendum executed by Clarissa Holloway is valid and enforceable. The conditions therein have been met. The current trustee body must recognize Ms. Zoe Holloway's rights under that addendum in full respect of the trust's terms. She established immediate grants, full legal title to the Holloway estate, the mansion, gardens, guest house, transfers to Zoe Holloway, ZH Foundation as trustee. All operating accounts frozen by Charles's legal action are restored. A full audit of past 10 years to be published publicly. Any discrepancies found to be remediated. A restraining order, preventing Charles Holloway and legal entities under his control from interfering with estate operations or public communication about the estate. Official apology from Charles Holloway to be issued and donor confidence framework to be reestablished. There was a hush in the courtroom as the judge concluded. Outside, flashes of cameras. Charles stood rigid, Ethan's eyes wet, his posture slackened. Elena squeezed my hand. My throat felt dry, but inside I felt something like sunrise. I stepped forward to speak, allowed myself a moment in the public gaze. What this means, I said, voice carrying out over microphones, is not just legal ownership, but ownership of responsibility. Ownership of promise. Clarissa wrote the clause because she believed a home, a legacy, stands only when truth is not buried. When people listen, not just to power, but to the small voices, the honest ones. Reporters scribbled. Cameras clicked. Donors nodded. Friends near me wept quietly. Then, a soft note. Charles's apology. Brief, delivered publicly. It was cold, too late, in many ways, but it was a confession, a recognition. And that evening, I returned to the mansion. The air smelled of lilacs from the east garden. The light was golden. I walked through rooms that once felt like battlegrounds. The east wing, the guest house, the library, Clarissa's old study. I paused in front of the portrait of Charles and Clarissa. No fury, just closure. I retrieved the portrait, carried it into the Hall of Memorials, removed Charles's name from the plaque beneath, replaced it with Clarissa Holloway, beauty, integrity, vision. Then I crossed the hall to Ethan's old study, once a room of cold silences. I opened the window, let in the air, sat at the old mahogany desk, looked through personal letters I kept, some bitter, many soft. There were contradictions, regrets, apology, and beneath them, in Clarissa's handwriting, a note. I trusted you to remember what fairness feels like. She meant me. She meant this. Harusendur Takarvaiki. In the weeks that followed, the Foundation's operations steadied. Donors wrote checks. Volunteers returned. News articles praised transparency. The garden tours flourished. The artist residency sent out its first newsletter again. Lily's health stabilized. Her garden bloomed. We planted roses around her window. She walked there at dusk, fragile but smiling, petals under her feet. Ethan visited. Not always easy between us. Sometimes quiet, sometimes apologetic. One afternoon, he asked if I would let him help with restoration, a new conservatory section, designed in Clarissa's watercolor sketchbooks. I considered it, looked at the plans, saw sincerity, and maybe forgiveness. I let him, not because I needed him, but because legacy belongs to more than law. It belongs to what one builds with love, with honesty, with truth. Banalsat. When autumn came, the mansion glowed in gold, leaves rustled, flowers faded, the wind carried cold ahead, but inside the rooms were warm, walls painted with Clarissa's pastels, windows open to memories and hope. I wandered the gardens one late evening, soft light, candles flickering along stone paths. I paused by the fountain, touched the water's surface, saw moonlight quiver. A friend joined me, asked, "How does it feel?" I closed my eyes, breathed. "Like finally being in my own skin," I said. "Like finally owning something that mattered." I never expected to inherit a mansion when I married in, but I expected more than silence, more than erasure, more than being treated like an ornament. What I inherited instead was a promise, a responsibility, a truth. I built gardens, preserved halls, repaired trust. I recorded every ledger, preserved every letter, saved every signature. I listened for Clarissa's voice in her notes. I honored her by acting. And in doing so, I discovered what ownership truly means. Not just controlling land or title, but being steward of story, of dignity, of people. The house no longer belongs to just one name. It belongs to the community, to transparency, to purpose. It belongs to the kindness hidden in small acts, the courage to speak with evidence, the power of building when everyone expects you to collapse. If you are reading this, remember, the papers can try to erase you, but your truth, your worth, once recognized, cannot be taken. If someone hands you contract, hand them back not silence, but solidity. Let your story speak.